On behalf of the National Park Service, welcome to Congress Hall tonight. Welcome to Independence National Historical Park. My name is Cindy McLeod, and I'm the superintendent here. I think it is just splendid that the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia is holding an event here tonight. I think it's just perfect that the discussion will be so relevant to the historic events that took place here. So thank you to the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for choosing this place. We were talking earlier about the irony of the event that was planned for last year this time that had to be canceled because the government was shut down. So thank you for your perseverance. It's terrific. Although New York City can proudly boast that it became the first city to be the capital under the Constitution, and although Washington, D.C. has been our nation's capital for over 200 years, for 10 very significant years, Philadelphia served as our nation's capital. This building, where you are, was the temporary home of the Congress from 1790 to 1800. You are seated in the House of Representatives. Don't worry, they're not historic seats. You can enjoy yourself. Upstairs, the Senate met. The president was only a block away. All must have been aware of the stakes involved at that time. Individual players operating on these two blocks were key movers of history. This was the site that witnessed intense debate that charted the future of the young nation and set precedents for now going on more than 2 centuries. Indeed, during the decade that Philadelphia was our nation's capital, our experiment in democracy, guided by our Constitution, was put to its first tests. The presidency was defined here by George Washington and then by John Adams, and by what was happening in Congress in this building. It's useful to remember a number of significant events, so let me go through a few. George Washington, of course, who had served as president of the Constitutional Convention before he was president of the country, wrote that what they had done in 1787 was little short of a miracle at Philadelphia. Others were not so sure. George Mason, living just a few miles from where Washington lived in Virginia, refused to sign the Constitution, partly because it lacked a Bill of Rights. Some were fearful that the new powerful central government might usurp the rights of the states and the people themselves. Only 2 years after the signing of the Constitution, the Congress submitted amendments to the states for approval by each, and the Constitution was amended, yes, 225 years ago, by what we know as the Bill of Rights, where it was ratified by the last required state while Congress met here. The first bank of the United States was chartered when Congress met here in 1791, setting the financial foundation of our country, and some argue that was as important as the political foundation of our country. But it was championed, of course, by Hamilton and opposed by Jefferson and Madison. The first census was completed while Congress was here. Nearly 4 million people were counted in that census in 1790, and then in the next 10 years, the population increased by more than 1 million. In the time that Congress met here, the number of representatives grew from 65 original members of the House to 106, and the building even had to be made bigger. So you all are in the addition over there. Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee gained their state house while Congress met in this building. The first excise tax, I said the word, was levied to help pay down the national debt, and it led to the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania in 1794. The controversial Jay Treaty was signed and ratified when this was our nation's capital. The treaty helped avert another war with Great Britain, at least for a while, but further divided our young nation's leaders. Not all of the history that happened here makes us proud today, but it is important to remember the whole record. The Constitution, you remember, was silent on the issue of slavery. And here in 1793, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. Many delegates felt that their way of life was threatened by the success of the grassroots movement that we now call the Underground Railroad. And of course, the platform next to me is where John Adams was sworn in as the new president on March 4th, 1797. It was perhaps the biggest test of our fledgling government, and it was the first peaceful transfer of power between our presidents. George Washington willingly gave up power of the executive office, and the country acknowledged a new elected executive in John Adams. You can see that the historic events here, well, you could say they rivaled the importance of the events next door, although I think next door at the Pennsylvania State House would probably eventually win out. But individual people moved history here, and that's why we remember them. You may have been present more recently when we've had some really interesting and sometimes fun first-person interpretation, people portraying Washington and Adams and bringing to life Hamilton and Jefferson, with Washington trying to arbitrate between them, their polar views. So it's a great room for inspiration, for understanding our foundations, and for envisioning our future. I'm sure the program tonight will be just as principled and provoking. Thank you again for being here. I would like to introduce Robert D. Kane, Jr., who will introduce this evening's speakers. Bob is the Eastern Pennsylvania Regional President of First Niagara Financial Group and a respected World Affairs Council Director. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Superintendent McLeod. It is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers this evening for this historic event. Tonight we welcome both Aaron David Miller and David Eisenhower. Aaron David Miller is currently the Vice President for New Initiatives and a distinguished scholar at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. His latest publication, The End of Greatness and Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President, which all ticket holders will receive a copy tonight. For the prior 2 decades, he has served at the Department of State as an advisor to Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State, where he helped formulate U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israel peace process, most recently as a senior advisor to the Arab-Israeli negotiations. David Eisenhower, grandson of General and President Dwight D. Eisenhower, is a historian and the director of the Institute for Public Service at the Annenberg Public Policy Center. He serves as a senior research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School of Communication and is a fellow in the International Relations Department at the university. He has lectured widely to audience across the United States on the presidency, foreign relations, and World War II. He is the recipient of 7 honorary doctorates. He will also be a guest speaker on the Council's trip aboard the small ship MS Le Boreal this coming April and will accompany cruise participants to the Normandy beaches. From a personal perspective, my father fought in World War II, and I was at Normandy 30 days ago. It's an experience that I will never forget. Craig Snyder, president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, will be serving as moderator between these two distinguished gentlemen this evening. Please join me in welcoming Aaron David Miller, David Eisenhower, and Craig Snyder. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Bob. We decided we would do the rest of this seated in a relatively informal way to make maximum advantage of the august setting that we have. Before we get to the substance of the event, I have a few thank yous to extend. First, I'd like to say thank you to Independence National Historical Park for working with us to provide this discussion in such a unique and important location. Thank you to Superintendent McLeod for being with us tonight, and to the park's interpretive specialist, Bill Coughlin, for helping us to organize the event. I'd like to thank Bob Kane and First Niagara for sponsoring tonight's event and for your ongoing support of the council. And I'd like to thank Comcast for helping us wire this historic building for the very first time so that we can live stream to other councils within our network across the nation and to our own members who could not be with us today in person. Let me also note that the council is honored to have among our distinguished guests in the audience this evening Julie Eisenhower and Israeli Consul General Yaron Seidman. Finally, a thank you to Stan and Arlene Ginsberg for making the entire series of which this event is a part, our Great Debate Series, possible. The Ginsberg put forth a challenge grant which was answered by UGI, Amatec, and SEI Private Wealth Management. Without such supportive members, we would not be here today and the council could not continue to fulfill its educational mission. We're delighted to have Aaron David Miller and David Eisenhower here with us to discuss the history and the future of the American presidency. Each of our distinguished guests will make about 10 minutes of opening remarks, followed by a discussion among the three of us, and then we'll open to questions from the audience. When we do open to your questions, I'm going to ask if you could form a line to the side of the podium and use that handheld microphone that was used earlier so that everything is captured by our internet transmission, so the people watching outside the room can participate in that way as well. Let me just then set the stage with a couple of thoughts. Few would dispute that the President of the United States is the single most both powerful and influential person in the world. So what makes a president great? Is that even a meaningful expression? Are the greatest presidents in history considered such because they best fulfilled the roles of national cheerleader, national symbol in their capacity as head of state? Or would greatness be defined more by legislative record or effectiveness in the execution of policy in the president's role as head of government? Assuming we could agree on a definition of greatness, does the structure of 21st century American politics allow the election of people who would fit that definition? We are appropriately humbled to be having this discussion this evening on these matters, as Superintendent McLeod said, on what is almost the exact spot where what I think can be argued to be the greatest moment in American presidential history occurred, that presidential power transition between George Washington and John Adams. So with that, I turn to our guests, and Aaron will start.
Greg, thank you. First of all, thanks to the World Affairs Council for hosting. To Superintendent McLeod, thanks for making places extremely important in life. And this is quite a remarkable place. I'm stunned by the simplicity of it. And yet when I think back, I think about the complexity of the challenges and the tasks that these men, largely men, faced during these formative years, early years of the Republic. I'm honored to be here with David. I would only note that the only two book events I'm doing are here at this historic place, and I was at UVA doing a presentation last week. And again, place is extremely important. Let me make a few observations about this book, why this book, and outline its basic conclusions. This book's origins started not in America, but in the Middle East. I had the honor and privilege of working for half a dozen secretaries of state over the course of a 25-year period on one problem, one challenge, and that is to say how to help Arabs and Israelis and Palestinians sort out what I termed, and was the title of my last book, The Much Too Promised Land. What I noticed during the course of our largely failures was that when in fact we succeeded because we had leaders who were masters of their political houses and to some extent masters of their times. They weren't prisoners of their experiences. They had a sense of strategy, a sense of vision, a sense of politics. Leadership is critically important in life, in all dimensions of the human enterprise. In politics, I think it's absolutely critical. It's validated to a certain degree by history. John Keegan, the great military historian, would say to you, if he were here, that 6 men between the years 1920 and 1950, 6, were responsible for most of the death, destruction, devastation, and prospects of peace and prosperity for much of the Western world. Marx as well argued, again, writing in the 19th century, men, again, he said, men make history, but not necessarily as they please. So in fact, it is the interaction between leaders, the interaction between the human agency and circumstance that by and large I think explains why things happen. So I looked around and I noticed a curious phenomenon. It seems that we had a leadership deficit, a global leadership deficit. 5 great powers, even with the rising powers, 5 great powers, all permanent members of the Security Council. Are any of them transformative leaders? Would you think any of them great? 193 countries are represented in the United Nations. Is there one leader who you could argue was transformational, transactional, and good too? That's why I think the death of Nelson Mandela had such an impact, because it was the passing to a certain degree of an age. I'll return to this in a minute. So from the global leadership deficit, it was only a hop, skip, and a jump, frankly, to the rather dysfunctional nature of our own politics and the presidency, the most salient and dynamic feature of our political system, and the one people pay most attention to. 535 members of Congress, 9 Supreme Court justices who are in and out of session. The president is in session all the time. It is much easier to relate to a man, one day a woman, his wife, his children, and the presidential pets. And the media, in fact, does relate incessantly, irrepressibly, and that becomes one of the great challenges, I would argue, for greatness in the presidency. But Craig talked about great, the actual notion of the word. There's an absence of greatness in our politics. I use the word great 15 times a day. Have a great day. She's a great tennis player. What a great movie. But the question is, what does it mean? I argue to you it means nothing, because we have emptied it of all significance in terms of our contemporary politics. Briefing a group of military officers last year, all combat veterans, I asked them to identify one political figure in the last 50 years that they would attach the label or term great to. They couldn't come up with one. And they asked me who my candidate was. I said, that's very easy. It's Martin Luther King. But the fact that King, with all his imperfections, has been dead now since 1968, and a leader like him has not emerged, the fact that the last great inaugural address ever given by a president was Kennedy's Ask Not speech, gives you some sense of the complexities and the challenges which make greatness in our politics not so easy to achieve. And I would argue to you that since we are unhappy with our politics and our politicians, we've done a degree of transference. We have transferred great from our politicians to our athletes and our entertainers and our actors. We have no difficulty at all ascribing great performance to them. We buy tickets, relatively expensive, but far less expensive than making the kinds of emotional and political and psychological investment in our own politics. In fact, we have, in a way, chartered out our politics. Watch West Wing, Aaron Sorkin's brilliant conception. It is a much more entertaining and dramatic rendition, frankly, of the presidency. This book was written to begin a conversation, not to end one. And it's driven by 3 central propositions. First, greatness was real and measurable in our politics and in our history. It was driven by real individuals who, by word and deed, define the meaning of great, and I define it according to a very high bar. That's why someone is great. I talk about 3 undeniably great presidents: Washington in the 18th, Lincoln in the 19th, FDR in the 20th. And the definition of greatness is confronting a nation-encumbering crisis that is so hot, so inescapable, and so relentless that it challenges the nation as a whole, and it is a sustained crisis. Crisis, in fact, is the only thing that I would argue domesticates our political system, creates a measure of acquiescence in our political elites. And if you have the right individual who walks through the door, in addition to crisis, the other two C's, character and capacity, you can actually not only manage the crisis, but extract from it a degree of transformative change that fundamentally changes the country forever for the good. Some aspect of how we govern ourselves, how we see ourselves, these three greats devoted themselves to. And after FDR, we've had great acts in the presidency, don't get me wrong. And great acts in the presidency are still possible, but undeniable greatness, no. That brings me to the second point. Greatness was once real and measurable. Greatness now is gone. Not because we don't have individuals who don't have character and capacity. David's grandfather had character and capacity, an extraordinary amount of it. But four factors have emerged to constrain effective and sustainable, if not great, presidential performance. One is FDR's high bar. It's hard to imagine any president after Franklin Roosevelt besting him. Johnson tried and was very much concerned in 1964 whether his electoral margin was better than FDR's. The media. Visibility guarantees vulnerability. And on one hand, it trivializes our presidents because they're overexposed. On the other, it forces a certain mediation which takes us away from our presidents. When Jack Kennedy addressed the nation October 22nd, 1962, the networks went back to normal programming. And this was at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's extraordinary to think about today. You have a 6 to 10 to 12 hour buildup before the speech, complete with a clock that ticks away the minutes. You have banks of analysts with their computers analyzing the speech, and every now and then, sometimes people are actually talking over the president. This relentless media strips away what de Gaulle rightly described as the mystique of authority necessary for greatness. And then there is, fortunately, the absence of a truly nation-encumbering crisis. We've had crises since the Great Depression and World War II, but nothing so encumbering, nothing that forced a sense of shared responsibility, shared sense of sacrifice, and a shared sense of obligation. We fought the two longest wars in American history, in Iraq and Afghanistan, with 0.5% of the public. When my father went to war in 1941, there were 130 million people in this country. 16 million of them put on a uniform. It was a defining moment. We don't have those anymore. Now, fortuitously, I would argue, we don't want them. Which brings me to the overriding point of the book. Why we can't have another great president, according to my definition, may be clear enough. But why don't we want one? Why would anyone not want another great president? Simply put, because greatness, as I defined it, as important as character and capacity are, it's driven by nation-encumbering crisis. And the very men who sat in this room created a political system designed to disaggregate power. They feared great men. To Benjamin Rush, great men were a lie. To Benjamin Franklin, they were the worst thing other than pestilence and famine. Now, don't get me wrong. They thought themselves great, to be sure. John Adams, who sat here and was inaugurated here, was so conscious of his reputation. No, they wanted to be remembered as greats. But the political system they left us, shared and separated powers, a strong executive, but an accountable and a constrained one too, created a situation, if I'm correct, where power and transformative change is only possible in response to nation-encumbering crisis. And if you look at the hottest, most irrepressible, transformative moments in American history, they're all, in some respects, driven by crisis. The assassination of Jack Kennedy, Johnson's 3 civil rights bills, perhaps the 64 civil rights bill, perhaps the most important piece of social legislation in the 20th century, driven by a sense of unease, of crisis, Jack Kennedy's assassination. And the civil rights movement, of course, which created a real movement, pushing change. So we don't want another undeniably great president. If you do, buckle your seatbelts, you're going to have a crisis. What we want, I would argue, is to stop expecting our presidents to be great in the Hollywood sense and allow them to be good, and not good in the banal sense. Good in the sense that they're effective and competent. Good in the sense that they remain within the law. Good in the sense that they have moral sensibility and they know themselves and are not driven by demons and aspirations of greatness which force them into scandal or force the country into enterprises that we cannot achieve. I'll close with one final comment. Why should you listen to me on this subject? I did an interview with Margaret Warner for the NewsHour at Mount Vernon, actually, a couple weeks ago. She asked me that question. It's fair. I'm a trained historian, big deal. I mean, David spent his life in and around the presidency and writing about it. Here's my answer to you. The founders, let me start this way. The word I and my is used twice in the Constitution. Why would the founders put a personal pronoun in the Constitution? Because they embedded the inaugural oath in the document. Because they knew, rightly, that the source of authority was not the president or the presidency. It was us. It was us. This is a national conversation, one that should be had and must be had. And we all have a role and a responsibility and a right to engage in it. Thank you very much.
Senator?
Well, Aaron, I think the quick answer why we listen to you is you're very good at starting conversations. And this is a wonderful way to start. I want to say how glad I am to be here at the World Affairs Council, too, sponsoring this great debate. I want to extend greetings to Denise Balla, to Bob Kane, to Craig Snyder, and to Cynthia McLeod. And to say, reminisce actually, the last time I was involved in a World Affairs Council event, I was again assisting with a book, and this was published by Sergei Khrushchev, son of Nikita Khrushchev, who has become a personal friend and is one of the very underestimated writers in the world today, one of the great writers. And he unveiled his book at the World Affairs Council, which I think gave it a great lift. He's one of the great writers, and so these are wonderful events, and it is a true pleasure to be here and to discuss the thesis of Dr. Miller's book, which is The End of Greatness, Why Americans Can't and Do Not Want Another Great President. I think the debate topic, I think we're debating. I think we're going to agree on some things, but I think we are debating. It is nice as a panelist to get a word in on this. And in 2 words, my answers are, that is to the notion of the end of greatness, can Americans, do they even want another great president? My answers are maybe and no. Maybe we will need great presidents in the years to come, in which we can have them. Caveat, I would say that we are always in need of near greatness. I think this might be consistent with what you're saying, but I also think that there's a danger of underestimating the complexity that our contemporary presidents face. The systemic, national encumbering crises are things that are familiar to us, but avoiding such things are also quite challenging as well. And so there's a constant demand in this country for near greatness. And I would say no, American greatness has not ended, and insofar as presidents reflect qualities of the electorate and personify values that characterize the nation as a whole, we will continue to require that presidents strive for greatness, whether they achieve it or not, again with every likelihood that many, if not most, will attain a measure, at least, of greatness. Now, the beauty of this subject is that the presidency is so pervasive in our culture, and the presidency has such a tangible bearing on social and economic life that everyone has an opinion about it. And all these opinions are valid insofar each is personally impacted by the presidency. And the fun of this subject is that we can debate it endlessly. We can endlessly debate the meaning of greatness, for instance. For like the office of the presidency, that word probably means different things to most of us. We can generalize, in fact, we must generalize, we agree to generalize, and greatness means something large. We all agree that it means something slightly different than good, or even desirable. It is a term that we would all probably apply to our country. I think it is also a standard that we legitimately apply in evaluating all presidents, Again, with many, if not most presidents, in my opinion, achieving at least a measure of it. So how to define greatness is a big question. Everybody has a list of the greats. Conventional historical appraisals, I would say, shed some light, but not that much light on the question. For instance, historians who usually write these lists of great presidents and so forth neglect public opinion polls on this question. They are taken. They are not taken seriously at all by historians, and I say that public opinion polls do say important things. Second, almost never factored in historical rankings of greatness are election and re-election successes and public confidence registered in presidents while in office. We can all agree that achievements or results or outcomes are crucial in presidencies, but do we define achievements in the same way? Greatness is often, if not usually, a partisan label. A narrow rule may be one that we can all agree upon, and that is greatness, and I would say this is consistent with Aaron's theory, and that would be to call greatness the label that descends on prominent figures in history who have ceased to have immediate political significance or relevance because political issues associated with them have been resolved. They can be quoted by all sides in America's political debate. These are the greats who reside on the Mall in Washington, where monuments symbolize the principles that they represented that are no longer in dispute in this country, and those are independence, union, and emancipation. Second, comparisons across time so often made are questionable, and that is something that we constantly do. I see presidencies in context, and I think, again, that on this matter of complexity, presidents today manage a $3+ trillion government. They command military forces based in over 100 countries around the world. They command instruments of mass destruction. They govern a nation 100 times larger than the population of America in Washington's era. They govern a nation traversable in hours, not months. To compare 18th and 19th and 20th century presidencies is very valid because leaders are leaders. They're leaders in every language. They have certain traits that we apply, it seems to me, that lead to leadership problems in all contexts. However, this raises or leaves unanswered the question of conduct of office, which is an entirely different question. The presidency today is what matters. And today the presidency serves needs, symbolic and practical. As a practical matter, America needs presidents to organize political action to address major issues facing this country. Without an effective presidency and without access to people who can solve problems, central authority in America would dissolve and the nation with it. Meeting national challenges requires ingenuity in the best of times. Personally, I define greatness by achievement, I think. And we can, again, debate this by beginnings and endings. The size of the challenge that a president faces, the size of the different challenges bequeathed to one's successors, the condition of the country at the conclusion of a presidency compared with the condition of the country at the outset. Admittedly, that is my way of looking at it, and admittedly, my quantitative measures, I think, would probably be considered somewhat subjective, so I'll leave it to others to just kind of guess the surprising choices that would be on my list of great presidents that I have known about. Putting presidencies end to end, American history has been, by and large, a story of unparalleled success. America has tackled and surmounted problems the equal of any faced anywhere in the world, including some challenges never addressed by traditional societies, integration, and civil rights, for instance. And so I think it is fair to say that there is plenty of greatness in American history to go around, and many, if not a majority of presidents, in my opinion, have achieved a portion of it. To quote the dying Franklin Roosevelt's fourth inaugural, quote, "I remember that my old schoolmaster, Dr. Peabody, said, 'In days that seemed to us then to be secure and untroubled. Things in life will not always run smoothly. Sometimes we will be rising towards the height. Then all will seem to reverse itself and start downward. The great fact to remember is that the trend of civilization is itself forever upward. That a line drawn through the middle of the peaks and the valleys of the centuries always has an upward trend.'" And so the logic goes as follows. Upward trending and successful societies require effective governance. National government has been for at least 100 years presidential government. Presidential government, in short, in America, has been a major success. Meanwhile, Americans have devised rules. governing the most exacting 2-year trial by ordeal ever invented by any political society anywhere, that is primaries. And in these primaries, we assess the greatness, the ability, the stamina, and the vision of would-be presidents. The ordeal of the campaign also illuminates and defines presidential mission. And that is, in the final analysis, the job of presidents, that is, to perform missions and to address problems. And since so much in America depends upon the simultaneous private actions of so many people in so many places, and since the president represents the country and personifies it to a degree, each in a different way befitting a country as diverse as ours, presidential performance is a dramatic reflection of our standards and aspirations. Americans require much of themselves. Therefore, Americans require much of presidents. Most people fall short of greatness, as do presidents, but they try and they expect others to try, and I doubt that the American electorate, as we know it now, will ever accept a president who accepts mediocrity, avowedly or by implication in any way. We have a rich fund of legends and history that can be applied to shape perceptions of the present and future, so I would say that notions of great should be connected to good, in the sense of the old adage, attributed apparently inaccurately to de Tocqueville, that America is great because she is good and will cease to be great if she ceases to be good. But America cannot be good or great if self-satisfied and led by people who are content to avoid offense and to observe all of the rules and all of the conventions. Leaders change things. All societies need leadership. The presidency is a leadership position. Now, greatness can be associated with overreaching, outsized powers and tyranny, especially elsewhere. In other words, we think of Peter the Great, the various magnificence and so forth that we've seen in various histories. And I would say that Americans have long been alert to the possibility of presidential usurpations in this country. But I also think that it is important to stress that any problem of presidential overreach is less likely to be resolved by coming to some kind of consensus about the presidency we want than by building up competing institutions, namely the Congress and the courts. We are sitting in a hallowed place. This is where Washington transferred power to Adams in 1797, defining the character of the presidency. This is also where our Congress sat until 1800. And so this is a place, anytime it seems to me, to acknowledge that if there is a crisis of presidential overreach today, it is because of the dysfunction of the United States Congress, the willingness of members of Congress incomprehensibly to allow the institution that they serve to present such a picture of ineffectiveness, and the acquiescence of the voting public in this. But help is on the way. I am aware of many suggestions that are forming out there for reforming Congress. They are in the winds. I would say that an effective Congress is the best guarantee of maintaining balance and restraining arbitrary elsewhere in the courts and in the executive. An effective Congress is a better safeguard against undue presidential power, in my opinion, than relying on presidents to be of a certain character to restrain themselves or trying to pin down candidates in debates about the limits that they will observe in office. And some Americans, in my opinion, will always ask greatness of presidents. They will not always get it. They ask it of themselves, or at least excellence and effort. The qualities of greatness that Americans recognize in presidents is a celebration of the effectiveness of our system, and it has been effective, and the special qualities of our people. Until we evolve into something else, free and effective government will be all our hallmark, and greatness, measured in terms of achievement and symbolically in the examples set by presidents, will always be a feature of it, of a successful, of a progressive, and yes, of a self-governing America. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both of our panelists for being worthy of the locale in starting this conversation. I'd like to pick up on something that each of you said and sort of put it together. You said that in defining greatness, you would include the requirement for character and the requirement for capacity in our presidents. You talked about our political system, our presidential campaign system, being a kind of trial by ordeal. So I guess my question is whether or not our current political system promotes an understanding, a discovery of who has capacity and who has character, or does it obscure the ability for the voters to discover those things? And let me just illustrate by way of example. So, Abraham Lincoln, we're told, had serious physical health problems, perhaps diagnosable mental illness by today's standards. Franklin Roosevelt, Jack Kennedy, perhaps a number of other presidents had at least colorful private lives that might be disqualifying in today's political circumstances. So do we live in a world now where the scrutiny of the campaign system has, in effect, lowered the bar for our presidency by raising standards in areas like health and private behavior? Anybody?
Lowered the bar by raising standards. Well, presidents live in fishbowls. And even Kennedy and even Reagan could not have contemplated. When the Berlin Wall went up in '61, I don't think Jack Kennedy was asked for a comment for 4 or 5 days. That's almost incomprehensible. And presidents, I think, can no longer husband the currency that is required to maintain a lot of authority and the mystique of leadership. Barack Obama is on Jay Leno, and they get on the subject of sports, and the conversation turns to bowling, and the President of the United States says, I bowled a 129. I guess that's good enough for the Special Olympics. So he finds himself the next morning apologizing to Tim Shriver. You go on The Daily Show. The question is whether or not you will ever again be seen as the kind of authoritative figure. All presidents have senses of humor. Jack Kennedy had a great one. But again, trivializing the office of the presidency is in large part a new creation. And I think even though it may be smart politics, my kid's 34, 32, every time we have this conversation about Barack Obama's presidential Twitter conference in June of 2011, to me, it doesn't sit quite right, but then they say, Dad, it's because you're old. Of course it sits right. This man's base, basically, was generational. He's being a smart politician. And if Jefferson had access to Twitter, Jefferson for sure probably would have used it. So I think the media, by and large, trivializes, exposes, guarantees vulnerability in a way that none of our previous presidents had. I think had the public seen the humiliating, demeaning positions that Roosevelt had to assume, being carried in and out of doorways through windows, I'm not entirely sure that a guy who became president in 1939 and would never be anything other than president, or never walk again, would basically have been able to be elected today. One last comment on who becomes president. I do not ascribe to the notion that our best people, because of the pressures of the campaign trail, I think David alluded to this, are somehow self-selected out. To want to be president requires a degree of strength, resilience, stamina, and raw ambition that was even tested in those days and continues to be tested. If you aren't certain you want this, don't sign up. And most people who are uncertain don't.
I think that's a great point about the meaning of the marathon that we ask presidents to run. And I agree that we have a media environment. In many ways, it's consistent with your theme, which I find very intriguing, and in many ways, one that I cannot argue with, because greatness is so associated with national catastrophe, these existential crises and so forth. What is the Chinese curse? May ye live in interesting times. However, I think that I'm a student of the media, particularly World War II, and I believe that the media is capable when the need arises. I think that what we're talking about here is what does the American system need? The American presidency is different than the other branches of government because it orients itself around projects. The Congress is here at all times. We're serving constituencies here at all times. Cases come before the courts at all times and so forth, but the presidency is mission-oriented. and it's responding to needs as they're defined in political campaigns. And I think where the need is great, I think the media is helpful. Dwight Eisenhower was able to take the media into complete confidence on invasion operations 72 and 96 hours before they went off. They would brief people. People put on uniforms in World War II because they understood the stakes of that conflict. I saw that again, I thought, in the Gulf War, 1991. I thought that our media was very, very helpful in that period. They raised no problems for President Bush and so forth. In other words, they understood that the cause was right. What do they cover? This is another thing. In other words, I think that we have this reserve capacity, and the presidency sort of organizes this to come together in response to need. And I think the media has demonstrated from time to time in the past that that is the case. So therefore, what does the trivia mean? I would say that the discipline of the press since 1941 has been a function, in fact, of how much trouble we perceive ourselves to be in. I think the less trouble we are in, the more trivial the press coverage. The less trouble we are in, the more focus on personal details and things like this. It's actually been a rather steady trend line since 1945 of greater emphasis on family, greater emphasis on the trappings of the presidency, on the personality, and so forth. And so I just imagine myself what would have happened, let's say, if we'd had a depression in 2009. We've averted that. I think that's the good news. That's the news of your book, and I agree with it. I think that my point is that we do not want to underestimate, it seems to me, our reserve as a free people to organize effective action around this office. We created it here in Philadelphia hundreds of years ago. It has served us very well. It continues to serve us in avoiding problems, and that requires definitely a measure of greatness.
I mean, David, again, one of the dangers of provoking an argument is that it tends to lead to oversimplified conclusions. I'm not a declinist. I have a extraordinary faith and commitment to the Republic. And I would even defend American exceptionalism as long as it stops at the water's edge. I mean, one of the reasons I think that we have been so successful, and this gets away from the notion of individuals, which I think we really have to find the balance between individual and circumstance. I mean, we're the only great power in the history of the world that has achieved a degree of physical security and detachment, unprecedented in history. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and fish to our east and west. Well, one historian, I wish it had been me, described as our liquid assets. These oceans have created a measure of and a margin for discretion and even for error and transgression that have freed us to a large degree, sometimes to a fault, from the forces of history and geography that motivate most countries with which we deal. So this natural advantage, combined with our abundance and our physical size and our political system, which is founded on an idea, which is, I think, has something to do with the primacy of the individual, truly the primacy of the individual, created a set of natural advantages which circumstantially shaped the potential and the possibility, at least for our first 2 centuries, of fashioning this continental system. We'd have to worry about what, Greece once exported great ideas in philosophy, now it exports bad debt. We didn't have to worry about that. So one of the reasons I wrote the book is because we put an inordinate amount of attention on the individual. When we think about the presidency, we do not think about the other half of what the founders intended, which was the accountability and the constraint. We think about Hamilton's notion of an energetic executive. And remember, the media has played a profound role in guaranteeing that our male presidents and one day female presidents will be easy on the eyes. I don't think it's even possible anymore to have an unattractive persona, given the amount of exposure in the White House. I mean, I may be proven wrong, but you look at our last 5 presidents, absolutely not. They are physical specimens, well follicled, They are relatively fit. It is a response. So I'm trying to figure out a way to get people to focus on the circumstances that create or do not create opportunities for a president to lead. The notion that presidents are persuaders in chief, president is elected with, it's a good election, 53% of the popular vote, interesting persona, great repetition, president speaks, creates forceful narrative, and transformative change just somehow occurs. But that's not how things ever worked.
Yeah.
And last point, and there was a line out of Richard IV Jack Kennedy loved. Hotspur says to Glendower, or Glendower says to Hotspur, I can summon the spirits from the vasty deep. And Hotspur says, but so can any man. The question is, do they come when you call them? And that problem has a lot to do, I think, with the circumstances that a president inherits and what the temper of the times are.
I think the circumstantial changes, the trappings, electronics, and so forth are very impressive. And I think that absent a test, I think that we can identify some factors that would inhibit the presidency. But you know, one of the ironies, I can remember this when I would say the polarization in the country really began, not so long ago, a decade plus ago. I can remember a commentator sort of reflecting, how could our economy and nation as a whole be in such good shape, and our politics be in such a bad shape? There is a kind of connection in this sense. I think that effective government, to a degree, depends on a perceived need for it. I think we indulge a lot of arguments in this country because I think that we're not sure whether we're facing serious problems or not. So I think that the true test of our system, and this is something that we're both looking at rather hypothetically, is the true test will arise when Americans come together and agree that we have certain challenges out there that we have to train the resources of our government and our people collectively to confront. We had, in fact, I was here at the Constitution Center, Independence Hall, this area, I remember in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down and Francis Fukuyama was proclaiming the end of history. The idea that America has sort of achieved a sort of state of living in a promised land and so forth is a very deep-seated thing over the last number of years, and it's helped a lot of us to enjoy America. And I think there's been a creeping premonition that we have problems. I'm an optimist, and I think that a lot of these, hopefully, some of these barriers that we've identified tonight will fall away as the recognition, the need for action arises.
Let me take this in a slightly different direction. If you went through a quick sort of conventional list of the most highly regarded presidents, it is largely synonymous with a list of the presidents who most expanded the power and authority of the office and the power and authority of the federal government. So there is a large chunk of America, the chunk that has given us the current House of Representatives, that does not view that as a good thing, the expansion of the power of the federal government. So is there kind of a planted ideology in the notion of presidential greatness?
Well, David's point, he's right, that the presidency is largely about mission. You don't occupy the office just to mark time. You want to do. And I think you've identified a critically important issue amongst all the issues that divide us, and it seems to me account for the polarization, the partisanship that has kept Congress in single digits, is this notion of the proper role of government. What is the role of government? Is it for effective remedy and reform? Big or small? Forget that question. And both Clinton and Obama invoked Ronald Reagan's name, even though Ronald Reagan grew government. Increased taxes 6 out of the 8 years he was president. I think the issue of the role of government, frankly, I would argue it's over. I mean, and when you, Tea Party rally from my office in the Reagan building, big sign, Tea Party rally, and the sign is, Obama, don't touch my Medicare. 75% of all of us are dependent in one way or another, if you include tax breaks, on some form of government program. And look at the Republican Party's approach right now to Social Security. It's fundamentally changed for many reasons. Now, yeah, we need entitlement reform. There's no question about that. But I think big government is here. The question is how to make it effective. And I don't, you're right though. I mean, most of the greats, or the almost greats, I call the 5 additional presidents, the close but no cigar presidents. That would be Jefferson, Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, maybe. I work for the Woodrow International Center for Scholars. I had a hard time trying to determine whether to keep him on or off the list. Harry Truman, our expansion of duties and responsibilities abroad has basically left us with no choice but to use government. The question is how to use it effectively. But I don't know, David, if you would agree.
Well, I would say,
in terms of the expansion of government as a central force
I think one
in
of
the
the
lives of
remarkable,
Americans.
I have to say, one of the remarkable things in my lifetime has been the amount of, I would say, authority and responsibility for this country that has been assumed by the private sector. And that is something I associate with the Reagan years. If you're looking for another sea change, FDR brings in a sea change, Lincoln brings in a sea change, Washington, of course, accomplishes separation with Great Britain, which is a sea change. So if we're looking at sea changes, I would say perhaps it was, as you say, a question of is the glass half empty or half full, a question of perception. But I think that we've been living through an era where we have devolved a tremendous amount of authority over our country, over control of our economy. We live in a globalized world right now, and that means the control of our economy in many ways defies direct political intervention. This was a problem during the financial crisis of 2009. I think that we are debating the proper role of government. I think we're also debating our place in a globalized world. I think that these debates are all there. And I think we're not sure whether this is working real well for us or if it is about to open up all kinds of vistas and great opportunities. I think that these are debates that are more latent than actual. Thinking about your category of greats and near greats and so forth, I think both in the case of a number of presidents that I can name, the crises of the era are implicit or latent rather than actual.
Teddy Roosevelt, for sure.
Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, for sure. Teddy Roosevelt takes, in fact, that's exactly what I had in mind. He's somebody who takes very vigorous action to forestall what he sees as a coming problem facing the country. I think that this debate is here. I think that your point is well taken, that we have all discovered that we are interdependent in some ways, but I think we're debating the meaning of that. Interdependence, by the way, is a word that has fallen out of presidential speech over the last 25 or 30 years. It was one of the most common words in presidential speech between, say, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt and Jimmy Carter. And I think that this debate is underway if, again, we have a systemic failure. That does provide an opportunity for greatness. I think that the American people can respond greatly under those circumstances. That's my point. We're practicing it all the time. We expect presidents, they aspire to greatness. They do. Very few achieve it. At least they're all great people in one way, but they don't achieve perhaps greatness in the office, but they aspire to it. And I think that taking your point, as I do, to be a completely accurate one, I also think my purpose is just to insert a reminder that this office means a great deal to us symbolically, and we expect a great deal of them. We can do that because we expect a great deal of ourselves. I think that's the nature of the country.
Could I ask David a question?
Sure.
Would you mind talking a bit about your grandfather? I mean, 8 years of peace and prosperity, no involvement in Vietnam, extrication from a war that Harry Truman couldn't get us out of, a very perhaps the last truly nonpartisan president. How do you, where does he fit for you.
Well, he fits. I could also talk about a father-in-law who also extracted us from another war that's
Yes.
chancier perhaps, but Richard Nixon, who I'm very proud of, by the way. The presidents see things, and this is a test of their vision in elections, I think that others don't see. Leaders change things, and that means that if you're going to be a leader, and if you're going to become a president, and you're going to change the direction of the country, however incrementally, you're seeing things differently, it seems to me, than an established leadership class would. I think that's in the nature of leadership. It's the nature of corporate leadership as well. One thing that Nixon saw in 1968 was that he could end the war in Vietnam and win the peace. That is a riddle. We win wars to win the peace. We don't end wars to win the peace. He saw something other people did not see, and we had 20, 30 years of relative peace. In fact, a complete victory in the Cold War without an intervening event after he left office in 1973. What Dwight Eisenhower sees in 1952 is something in between the position of victory, which MacArthur is advocating, who was the true, I would say, alternative to Eisenhower in 1952, and the treadmill of the Korean War, and essentially waging this confrontation as Harry Truman faced it. Harry Truman, as great as he was, and I will concede that he was, and a very attractive person, did leave office with about 22% confidence in the Gallup poll. I think that matters for something. That way was not working. The MacArthur way was not working. Eisenhower comes up with a way that presidents do all the time. Suddenly we turn up 3-4 years later with people cracking champagne in Geneva, crucial decades passing, the economy on a roll, our problem solved. And I think that that means that we have flexibility. The presidency provides that. I see the presidency as a sort of like an expansion hinge in the federal government. It provides flexibility because it provides an opportunity for a powerful individual to come in and, in effect, provide a different direction when necessary. It's not always necessary. Sometimes elections are about personalities only. Sometimes elections are completely fulfill their business on election day when somebody's defeated and somebody wins. But very oftentimes, and in the elections that dealing with my family, my extended family, the Eisenhower and Nixon stories are both interwoven, and they both deal with our two great limited wars since 1945, Korea and Vietnam. And in both of those cases, the Eisenhower and Nixon presidencies are particular examples of what you and I have agreed on, that the presidency's mission-oriented, that they come in, they have a problem that they must address, and they bring these great resources to bear on it.
So we've now had our first African-American president. Undoubtedly, we will sometime soon, perhaps very soon, have a first woman president. These events are obviously fundamental to our culture, but I want to get your view on, both of you, on whether or not they're fundamental to the office of the presidency. Does that kind of diversity in the Oval Office change the office itself?
No, I think it just highlights the characteristic of it. The thing is, presidents embody, they represent things about us. And if we elevate a woman to the presidency next time around, we're making a statement and that's a very valid approach, it seems to me, to elections. Because elections are symbolic. National elections are symbolic, I would say. What do you say, Aaron?
No, I think that's right. The reaffirmation, David's point about the one factor that historians don't like to think about is public validation.
Yeah.
We've never had a great one-term president. I mean, you might be able to make the case for James Polk, as some historians do. Barack Obama tells Diane Sawyer in February of 2009 he'd rather be a good one-term president. But that just doesn't compute. I didn't believe it at the time, and I don't believe it now. The revalidation is incredibly important, in large part because the office is us. It's ours. And this notion that public validation is not important, the founders may have been worried about it, as they were, because they really didn't want a presidency that was quote-unquote popular in character. They feared the mob, maybe even worse than they did the kings and the royal governors. But that validation is extremely important, and it's a reflection of our system. That Barack Obama and Sarah Palin both emerged, and I say this, and people usually snicker when I say it, but it is not intended that way, and I have to end up explaining this, that Barack Obama and Sarah Palin emerged in the same political time, in my judgment, is a validation of the flexibility and the fluidity of our politics, and an inherent validation again of the fact that we are probably the only political system in history based on an idea. And that idea is that individuals actually count for something. And by virtue of their talents, circumstances, luck, they can rise through the system. And that message has to be reflected in the presidency. So that diversity is critically important.
I would say something else too. I think this is, I'm very struck by your point about the transformative power of leadership and so forth in the Middle East and other circumstances that you've seen. It's leadership does make a difference, I would say. I think this is the important point here. By validation, what I'm saying is that these people embody certain traits and so forth that we identify with. But I would also say that leadership is also more recognizable in the rearview mirror. In other words, we do have people that do not seem to be spectacular leaders at the moment. But it is sometimes difficult to fully appreciate the contributions of a leader or whatever in the present tense. Certain people have a process that I've noticed, and I teach a presidential seminar at the University of Pennsylvania. A process that I've noticed is how Ronald Reagan has become a kind of bipartisan figure.
Right.
I think we all remember how controversial his presidency was, in fact. In fact, I can remember knowing people in Washington who would sort of take me aside and say how, quote, touchy, close quote, things were in D.C. in the early part of his presidency. I think that greatness is also, your point about the Mandela event is well taken. I also think greatness is something that sometimes occurs to us in hindsight. I think one thing that we can be assured of is that with a competitive system and the nature of our country, and because of the very nature of the system, as you say, the faint-hearted need not apply. We're going to get people who are very determined. They're going to be visionary, and they have to run a tremendous marathon to reach that office. I think we can be sure that the people who get there have a great deal to offer. They have proven a great deal.
I mean, it's a test. If the notion that all presidents, not all of them, but many presidents are basically blind dates, I think in a way now is less true than before. I mean, by 2011, you had 8 Republicans who had declared 8. When Jack Kennedy announced it's amazing to me. He announced his campaign, I believe, in January or February of 1960. And the elections were in November. I mean, there was no permanent campaign. Mm-hmm. It's fundamentally changed. And
Eisenhower announced his 6 weeks before he was nominated.
Right.
It was a
special circumstances.
It's a different era. In fact, primaries and that, in fact, Aaron's put his finger on a very important point here. I mean, we have changed our system without really recognizing it, without changing the wording of presidential powers and expectations surrounding the office. We have, in fact, revised the office in a big way. And primaries have probably had a greater impact, or as big an impact, as anything. I don't think we had a full-blown primary system until about 1976. And primaries prior to that were beauty contests. They were areas that you would go into a primary to demonstrate that you can turn out a vote and that you're an attractive candidate and sort of hone your skills. But I think that change is connected somehow with everything that we're talking about. It is connected with media. It's connected with, there are different requirements for the office now. I would say the office is probably physically more demanding, which is one reason why a Franklin Roosevelt does not get there. The fact that Franklin Roosevelt could conceal his illnesses in the 30s show that the office was physically less demanding. It was a man killer. It probably killed Franklin Roosevelt, but it was physically less demanding than the office that we have now. So we need athletes, people who are in shape.
I want to open this up to questions from all of you. If you would form a line, if you would, to use the microphone on the podium. While any of you are coming up who'd like to ask a question, I just want to make a sort of programming note that you can see additional comments on Charlie Rose this evening. This was taped obviously before, but you'll have the ability to see Aaron on Charlie Rose this evening if you would care to tune in. We would encourage that. Please.
Good evening. The historian Ibn Khaldun recognized a quality in a nation, in an empire, that he called asabiya, which he took to be a national cohesion that allowed a great empire to arise. And he identified the loss of asabiya, the loss of this cohesion, and the ability to impose a nation's values, both internally and externally, as the mark of a declining empire. Is the loss of that asabiya in the United States an indication that our greatness as a people can no longer be represented and reflected in the greatness of our chief executive?
Yeah, it's a fascinating comment. I talk a little bit in the book about crises that involved inclusion, out of which national obligation, sacrifice, and responsibility were shared. We've lost faith in institutions. It's no wonder that the two most, whether they're important, the two most visible protest movements in this country in the last decade, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, are both anti either big government or big corporations and banks. Conversation with Jenny Miller, my daughter, 10 years ago, she's 34. Your parents had the Great Depression and World War II, shaped their values. You, speaking of myself and my wife Lindsay, you had Vietnam, you had civil rights movement. They shaped your visions and values. What does my generation have? It was a plaintive question from a 22-year-old, and I could not answer her. I could not answer her. And it worried me. It truly worried me. I worry greatly that that sense of national identity has been lost. Much has changed for the better in America, and I'm not arguing that we go back to the 40s and the 50s. But some of what was lost is extremely important. And it's just not there. If a people doesn't imagine itself great, or shaped by some common enterprise, some common challenge? Can it actually look to its leaders for greatness? I don't know the answer, but I worry greatly about it, because as David knows, it's not just leadership we should be talking about. It's followership. The old quip that a leader without followers is just a man or a woman out for a walk basically seems right to me. So I don't know how to reinvest get people to reinvest in their politics. But if by asabiya that's what's intended, I think there's a problem there.
Yeah. I think it worries everybody because we don't have ready tests. We're not being summoned really to demonstrate our national loyalty. By the same token, I'm an educator. I think we're both educators. I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been there, and this has been just a wonderland for years, because the students that I deal with all are very purposeful. They all work very hard. They're all what I would call American, in the sense that we define ourselves differently from other people, and a way to grasp that, it seems to me, is to go overseas. You travel overseas, you're on cruises. Julie and I are on cruises from time to time. And that is where you kind of come into contact, it seems to me, with alternatives. And you become aware of what it is Americans have, and that is we get things done. We expect things to work. We expect things to be better. We rely on ourselves. We work hard. We believe that the system will reward us. Generally, that, I see, in the generation that I work with. And Aaron, I would say the formative experiences that you're referring to, and I look back on those college days, whichever side of that divide you were on, everybody was active because they believed they could make a difference. And in a strange sort of way, this is the kind of connection. I think we're all going to be in doubt until we can identify a challenge or whatever that tests the spirit in a direct way. And I think we have very good reason to be concerned in the meanwhile, particularly in the tenor of American politics, hopefully, in the tenor of American politics. I can't not disagree that this is a concern. I have to say anecdotally from what I see, in my neck of the woods as an educator, I would compare the students I've seen over the last 15, 17 years or so favorably with students I saw before, for what it's worth.
Please.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to express, I think, probably what a lot of Americans feel. That is a great degree of cynicism. What it costs $1 billion to run for the presidency for each candidate, I think that we begin to think that they are working for the people who pay that bill, not for the people of the United States. And when 1% of the population owns about 53% of the assets of the country, I think they are working for them. And I'm going to challenge your characterizing Mr. Roosevelt as a great president, because I have a book at home called The Abandonment of the Jews, where he closed the doors to escape. And basically, he is challenged as being agreeing to the Holocaust by closing the doors. As we all know, the spirit of St. Louis book, and how now our country has 11 million people. They wouldn't accept 800. We have 11 million people. I think that benefits the Republicans for cheap labor and the Democrats for votes. I think most of the people are very cynical. I think what you said, I mean, both of you, I admire you both very much. I enjoyed your talk, but I think the country is just being owned by, we have an oligarchy. Thank you.
Comments?
Yeah, I mean, I would, before I go, I'm going to give you a card because I have a better book for you than The Abandonment of the Jews, which was written by two historians at American University. Yeah, you know, just to, wait, just because I really follow through on everything. I'll give it to you. I'll put it out here so I definitely won't forget. Look, Roosevelt was an imperfect individual, to say the least. The book FDR and the Jews argues, however, that given the constraints, he did about everything he possibly could do and was asked to do. Now, against the determined and willful genocide, the killing of 6 out of every 7 European Jews, on hindsight, it will never be perceived to be enough. Roosevelt's other transgressions, the imprisonment of the Isi and the Nisi, Japanese Americans, first and second generation in California, was an abominable act, and probably didn't challenge the judgment of the military, who may have seen fifth columns, and perhaps even an insurgency. I can't speak to the broader issue of how to socially engineer a redistribution of wealth in this country. There are major imperfections. Income inequality is certainly one of them. And you identify cynicism in politics, which is probably, and withdrawal from politics, as one of the gravest challenges that we face. But I appreciate your comments.
One of the good pieces of news that I've encountered being on the periphery of politics, having experienced campaigns and so forth, the good news is that outspending your opponent does not guarantee success. I can cite chapter and verse a lot of elections where the underfunded opponent actually manages to win. I think and it does, our system does feel right now very burdened by, I would say, contributions, campaign finance. In fact, a book that I'm aware of that is coming out about reform of Congress, which was something that prompted my observations about Congress sitting here in Congress Hall, really deals with a lot of these structural problems that breed this cynicism and this partisan divide. One of them being campaign finance, the others being the way we draw districts in this country and so forth, and a lot of things that have sort of led to the perpetuation of oligarchies and leadership systems. But by the same token, we have a free press. We have the ability to come together in a forum like this and exchange ideas. You have the ability to write books. I have the ability to write books. We have a great educational system. We have a very educated, it seems to me, a very engaged citizenry. And so I think that these problems, when they become undue or threaten to suffer the system, at least suffocate the system, at least historically, we've been able to cleanse them. I think we all feel like we're on the verge of something significant. We're in a transition period right now. We had a financial crisis in 2009. We still haven't come out of it completely. We're not certain where this leaves us. We're not certain whether that was a correction or whether that was a systemic failure of some kind. We're still sorting that out. And I think that while we wait, I think that it's probably wise to take inventory of potential problems that lie ahead of us as a self-governing society. But I think I'd be far more concerned about us if we were not responding to a identified crisis, as I think you imply in your book.
Just one follow, not to whistle past the graveyard, but I hear it all the time now, particularly in Washington. The world's out of control. It's on fire. Things are worse than they've ever been. And I think to myself, but wait, that's really not true. I mean, the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, killed roughly 3 to 6% of the world's population, including 600,000 Americans. It was airborne. Now, I'm not minimizing the potential, because the math on Ebola may be very bad. But I think it's something we can manage. ISIS. The media beat the drum on this. Last year, the State Department reported that there were 17,891 global fatalities to terrorist attacks. 17,891 people were killed in terrorist attacks. 16 of them were American citizens. And I think this perspective is extremely important to continue to offer up.
Once again, Aaron, I would say we're in a transition period because we're not, these problems are emanating from non-state actors.
Yes.
In other words, we don't have a vocabulary yet to deal with a phenomenon like ISIS, which actually, this is a movement which spans 3 countries or so in the Middle East. It's not something where we can sort of hold a government or a people accountable. We don't know how to respond to it entirely. So we're in a transition period, and we're trying to figure this out. But I think that magnifies our perception of problems, exactly as you say. This is a much safer, at least on paper, stable period than, say, immediate post-war. The atomic genie, the atomic bomb has just been launched. 55 million people have just been killed. We've learned the possibilities of genocide. We're confronted with all of these horrors. 2 continents have to completely rebuild. Here we are, years later. We have things working for us, I think. You know what I'm saying?
Last question, Mitchell.
Sure. I want to thank you all for very interesting perspectives tonight. It's getting me to rethink things, and I wanted to throw this out as a question. As I think of presidents, and I think of starting with President Eisenhower, and things that he warned the country about military-industrial complex, and the highway system, and then you move through President Johnson, what he was able to get through, a lot of the ideas of President Kennedy on the Civil Rights Act. And then you move to presidents like President Nixon, who opened up our relations with China that was transformative, set up the EPA. And then I move even to a president I never thought as a great leader, President Carter, what was accomplished with the Mideast Accords. And then I move like to what President Reagan did working with Congress. And then I move to President Clinton in terms of what was accomplished both in the Mideast as well as what was accomplished in terms of Serbia and Bosnia, that type of leadership. And then I move even, it's interesting, I don't know how I feel about President Obama at this point, frankly. and what the final verdict will be on the health care and everything else. But it was certainly transformative in many ways. I'm curious if you could maybe address some. It's getting me to rethink how we evaluate great leadership and what we should focus on and so forth. So I thank you.
Good. I mean, the storyline of the presidency, in my judgment, since the country has survived its most formative challenges, and with more prospective power at home, with the capacity to address problems, if we could somehow right our dysfunctional politics, and our influence abroad, despite all the challenges we face, I think is a testament to the fact that by and large, the presidency these many years, 44 presidents, 43 different presidents, since Grover Cleveland was president twice in non-consecutive terms, the storyline is not a story of mediocrity. It's a story of good, dedicated, often brilliant individuals who were capable of extraordinary things and discrete acts of presidential greatness, including some of the ones you identify, possible and actually happened. Had the presidency just been a story of great men, they would have become obsolete, because greatness in any dimension of the human enterprise is by definition rare. It just doesn't come along. So by and large, I mean, again, despite the annoyingly negative concept that we don't want another great president, we need to think through in realistic terms, very sober, realistic, principled and pragmatic terms, what we expect from our presidents. And David, I think, may be right, and others have pushed this phrase to me. Presidents can't stop aspiring to be great. That, I think, would not be good. We just have to somehow understand more about the challenges and travails of the office so that we don't infantilize ourselves. I guarantee you, within a year, within 1 year, we will be waiting again for the one. The one will present himself or herself, and we will want this. The only danger is that we somehow surrender our own agency. We're not going to be rescued here. Together with great leaders and with our own involvement in civic affairs, there's a huge potential to close the gap between what America is and what we want it to be.
Well, that's really well put, and I would say that, again, I think where my emphasis falls is what I've observed in these human beings, and that is the extraordinary dedication, study, energy that they bring, that they focus to these enterprises. I think that's true of the people who, I think the people who do reach the presidential office are in fact rare. 44 people in our history, that's a small number. I think well, let me put it this way. They are great people. Whether they're great presidents is an entirely different question. I don't know whether Franklin Roosevelt was a great guy, but I mean, he was a great president, undeniably, and so forth. And I think also your point about, it seems to me, losing ourselves or whatever in an election, I come back to where we are, and that is Congress Hall. And this was an idea that Dwight Eisenhower did have, and other Republicans have sort of shared with him. And that is that I think that it's important to recognize that a self-governing country is something that relies on power operated and being effective at a number of levels. As a practical matter, if you're going to be active in government, you're not going to be a staff member in the White House. You're going to have to be active in state affairs, and you're going to have to be local, active with your congressman and so forth. So sitting here in Congress Hall, with congressional elections around the corner, what sticks in my mind is let's take these elections seriously too. Let's take these politicians seriously too. Let's look at issues at that level, because so much is being decided there, and there's so many opportunities for us, it seems to me, to exercise leadership at that level. That is, and I think Aaron and I have sort of agreed here, one of the unique things about America that was institutionalized by the decisions reached at this very spot, and that was to provide a setting in which people could individually be free and to make their way in the world. And this is a quality that the presidency reflects. It's a quality that our institutions attempt to secure. We need to be involved in them and resolve, I think, on this this site here that the problems that Aaron sets forth in this book and so forth are ones that we will take very, very seriously as citizens. Thank you.
I want to thank both of our guests. I want to thank the Park Service and all of you. We're adjourned.